Hello and welcome to Capitol Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm pleased to be your host for this show, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight to the doings as to people and events in and around our state capitol. We have a special guest today, Capitol, I'm already fooling around with your name. It's Captain is your title, and it's Jim Stevenson from the Oregon State Police. Welcome to Capitol Insight.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Now, we've been chatting a little bit as background information, but I'd like to share with our viewers some information about you as a trooper and as a captain with the Oregon State Police. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, Captain Stevenson?
Sure. Well, I'm a native of Oregon. I was born and raised in Portland, and I was hired by the Oregon State Police in October of 1971 as a recruit, and I started my career in Milton Freewater, Oregon. And later I transferred to Tillamook, and I became a supervisor in Beaverton. I became a corporal there and transferred to our Beaverton office, and then since been promoted to lieutenant and now captain, and I'm in charge of the patrol division of the Oregon State Police, which is the division basically responsible for all the officers that perform the uniform patrol services out on the highways throughout the state.
Now today, as we talk about the patrol division, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, but one of the things we'll be talking about are some spiked strips that we happen to have on the coffee table here. And can you give me a quick idea of what these are all about?
Yes, the Department of State Police has a pursuit policy, and basically that policy allows latitude for the state police officer to use his or her good judgment in whether to pursue a vehicle that is attempting to flee or not. And the officer must take into consideration the gravity of the crime, the risk to himself, herself, citizens, before really continuing in a pursuit type situation. And given a pursuit where an officer has tried to hold back, in other words, not press the pursuit, and the fleeing individual continues to elude, and it is for a significant crime and there is not a significant risk to life or property, these devices will be deployed for the suspect vehicle to drive over. And what they're designed to do, there are spikes in this strip, and as the car drives over them, the spikes actually enter and penetrate the tire and remain in the tire. They pull out of the strip, and these are hollow, these spikes, and the air slowly deflates out of the suspect vehicle and therefore terminates the pursuit in a gradual sense. In other words, the tires don't go immediately flat, which would be a very, well, the potential there for an accident is significant if that occurred. And by slow deflation, the car will eventually slow down. In some cases they continue, but they lose the rubber off their tires and so on, but that's the design of them.
All right, I've sort of used it as an introduction because for a few minutes we'll be talking about Captain Jim Stevenson, Oregon State Police. We'll be talking about the patrol division and sort of the work that your division does out on the highways. And the spike strips, which we have here, are sort of a nice conversation piece on the coffee table to talk about technology and what we have to deal with in these modern times in terms of trying to get after suspects. But before we pursue the pursuit, I'd like to fill in a little bit more about what a state trooper goes through in terms of career choices and what brought you into police work in the first place.
Sure. Well, before I was hired, I was working in a parts department in Portland, and I had attended, didn't complete my 4 years at Portland State, but I attended 3 years of college there. And I just was not satisfied, I guess, with what I was doing in life. And I've always had a keen interest in law enforcement. And so I made application with 2 different agencies at that time, and the Oregon State Police hired me. I guess I had a feeling where I wanted to help people. That was my initial drive to become a state police officer. And I feel now that with 22 years on the department, I have fulfilled that throughout those 22 years. And once I got on the department, all recruits go to the patrol division, or I should say are assigned to the patrol division. And after they've been on a period of time, they've had a time to experience the different activities that the officer performs. We have our Criminal Investigation Division and our Fish and Wildlife Division, and in addition to the patrol. And in patrol, you get to work a flavor of all three of those areas. And I had interest at one time to go into criminal. I also had interest to pursue fish and game, but I elected to stay in patrol because of that diversity throughout the career. And basically, the patrol officer out there provides uniform services to our citizens. And it can be in the way of traffic, it can be in the way of investigating crime, it can be in the way of motorist assist, investigating accidents, and enforce our fish and game laws also, which of course protects our natural resources. So it's a multifaceted job, and some people probably would say it may not be it's a thankless type job, but in a lot of ways there's a lot of rewards too.
How long have you been in charge of the patrol division?
Just now about 6 months.
And how many officers would you have under your direct supervision through the chain of command?
Yes, right now in the 93, 95, as far as field force people, troopers and sergeants, there's 402.
Now, with those 402 troopers and sergeants out there in the field, are you out there routinely supervising them, or do you basically work out of headquarters in Salem?
Yes, I work out of general headquarters in Salem, so a lot of my capacity or my functions are administrative and program management for the division. And the immediate supervision is done by initially the first line supervisors in the field, which are the sergeants. And also we have other top command out there in the field that oversee those officers, but the first line immediate supervisor is the sergeant out there.
Now, the focus of our curiosity, so to speak, or a desire for some capital insight this time is pursuit, and that's because there have been some news stories of late about police pursuits, not necessarily state police. We could be talking local police or the sheriff's department, where they've had to go after suspects who seem to be more and more sophisticated these days about how to elude the authorities, and maybe even trying to take advantage of a police officer's desire to protect the community by not forcing a dangerous situation. Over the years, have there been some changes in the thinking? Do we have some developed policy now about how to manage these pursuits? You mentioned at the very beginning of the program some of that policy. Can you give us some of the flavor of that?
Sure. Well, the Department of State Police has a policy. We are currently in the process of review, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, we leave a lot of it to the good judgment of the officer and what is really the purpose of that person eluding. And a lot of times we do not know. But we feel a minor traffic infraction or misdemeanor or even some levels of crime do not necessitate the risk of pursuing a vehicle. So therefore our policy does allow for termination of a pursuit, giving those factors of risk to citizens and property.
Now let me interrupt you at that point and ask, when you make that decision to terminate, do you usually have sufficient additional information that will allow you to track down that suspect anyway, such as identification by visual description or vehicle license, that sort of thing?
Yes, and that is definitely a strong factor in terminating, and I wouldn't say that's the only. I mean, obviously, if we don't know who the person is and the risk is too high, back off and discontinue it. But in those cases where we know who the suspect is or have identifying information about the vehicle that can eventually get us there, yes, that would be a good cause to terminate.
And as part of the thinking there, well, we're going to get this guy anyway, let's not create a high-risk situation out here if there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people on the sidewalk or whatever. Is that part of the thinking?
Yes, that's absolutely correct, because a pursuit is very volatile. I mean, the potential's there. You can't have a blanket policy, you're going to let them all go. But so you have to really weigh the situation, and that is definitely a factor that weighs very heavily on whether to pursue or not.
Now, I heard once, in terms of the history of the state police, and in terms of the development of statewide police departments in most states, that there was a time when criminals would tend to, as they're rushing out of a given community or even a county, think, well, the sheriff at some point is going to get tired of following me because at some point I'll be in the next county and it'll be out of his jurisdiction, and so maybe he won't continue to give chase. This is just the kind of lore that I've picked up over time. And that was one of the driving forces between the establishment of statewide police forces was, well, we've got to have some folks to maintain some continuity among all jurisdictions and to help keep after these characters. As you work with the sheriff's departments, do you find that there's now a network that's been developed to make sure you can maintain the pursuit of these kinds of suspects?
Yes, in fact, a lot of our local working type relationships with the sheriffs or the city police departments, they have a local rule or a local policy which will dictate what will happen if a pursuit continues into, say, for example, the city of Portland or something like that, and where one agency may take over depending on which jurisdiction it goes into. And that's not only intrastate, but also interstate, in other words, going into, say, Washington or California and those types of situations. So yes, that is worked out. And we try to minimize the number of vehicles in pursuits because obviously you have more vehicles, there's more risk for hazards.
As you maintain this coordination, there must be communications arrangements that are made and this sort of thing. Has this been worked out also?
Yes, well, with our officers, they're required to notify our regional dispatch centers immediately when they're involved with as much information as possible, and if to then start setting up assistance, whether it be our own or another agency. So yes, that communication would develop, and in some parts of the state, we do communicate directly with the local sheriff's departments.
As far as this whole system goes, how effective is it? How often do we get the suspect when you have a pursuit going?
Well, a lot of times the person gets away. In these situations where it gets to the point where a hollow spike strip is used, we've deployed them 25 times since 1987, and in every case the vehicle has stopped without any injury or damage. And if the person has not jumped out of the vehicle and ran, why we have been able to apprehend the persons in almost every one of those cases.
So in terms of this new technological device, as I'll call up these strips with the hollow tubes, 25 usages in the last, say, 6 years.
Yes.
And every one of them successful.
Yes.
Are we looking to other kinds of technology to help us? Do you ever make use of aircraft in these pursuit situations?
Yes, we have utilized our aircraft, and in this last legislative session, the Department of State Police is going to acquire an aircraft specifically for traffic. And that is going to be one of the purposes of that plane, if there is a pursuit, to get it up in the air. And I'll just use a little example where we were using one of our existing aircraft down in the Medford area here about 2 weeks ago. And we were doing a saturation patrol on I-5. And a motorcycle was doing, I believe it was somewhere around 100 miles an hour. And they did not stop, and nor could the officers really stay with the motorcycle due to its versatility. But the airplane was able to follow that motorcycle to a business and saw the rider pull in behind the business and walk inside. And the aircraft obviously led the patrol cars on the ground right to that location. And as it turned out, the person was not just speeding, there was warrants for the person was suspended, and so on.
Now, as we deal with all of these attempts to get these suspects, are there any frustration levels that may develop for police as they have to deal with the rest of the system, the follow-through?
Well, I think any time, obviously the police officers' work, a lot of it is getting persons into custody for various offenses, to remove them from society in a limited sense. And the frustration level does exist, and I guess we have preached to our officers from the time they come on to not let this eat you up inside, because we are only part of the system, and there's a lot of factors that go into the system. But if an officer dwells on that too much, I think it can have some negative effects on them, and realize that they're doing their job by getting the person off the road or in custody, and they fulfilled their mission.
Well, I'll mention, Captain Stevenson, that some of us are trying to reduce that level of frustration for the officers by making sure the rest of the system does its job. Right. With that brief comment, I'll mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm your host, State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. If you ever have any questions or concerns that you'd like to address to me at Capital Insight, just write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. And we'll do the best we can to address those concerns. And continuing right on with you, Captain Stevenson, I was starting to allude to other elements of the system. Of course, we have the challenge of making sure the courts move the cases, making sure that there's appropriate detention and appropriate facilities for detention, and of course also dealing with rehabilitation. There's trying to have enough rehabilitation resources for offenders who want some help at being rehabilitated. And those are all issues that we have to deal with in the legislature. But pulling back to the more specific focus of the Patrol Division, you had mentioned earlier that you're going through a review of the pursuit process, and I'm curious as to what's going on there.
Yes. There's the University of Detroit Mercy in Michigan, and they do analysis of police departments' pursuit policies. And it was a few months ago, and we submitted our policy to them. And in addition, they surveyed our officers by poll, along with 7 other states. And their analysis or their results were that our policy is somewhat restrictive compared to the other states that were analyzed, which I think is okay. In other words, it's not an open blank check to do basically what you want. But also, as a result of that, we are currently in review of our current policy, and we're in a 1-year study of our policy, and we are asking every time that one of our officers is involved in a pursuit that a questionnaire is filled out by a supervisor and sent into our research and development unit here in Salem. And through July, we started at the beginning of the year, we've had 76 pursuits by our officers. There's been 3 injuries to suspects and 1 injury to one of our troopers in those, none of them serious. But like I say, we have not done any analysis of this. Once the year is completed, then we will go and start looking at either policy review and analyzing our current policy.
Now, as part of that review, it's obvious that you're trying to do an objective job here. You're talking about injuries to suspect, injuries to troopers, and of course, if there had been any, you would have mentioned injuries to bystanders. And yet the news media will pick up on, say, a chase such as it recently occurred in Clackamas County, where someone who had already been weaving is pursued somewhat, and apparently weaves over into the opposing lane of traffic and hits another vehicle head-on, and the driver of the other vehicle is killed. Or another pursuit where the person is driving still at the legal speed and the officers are just following at the legal speed, and I'm just relying on what I saw in the news accounts, and then the car misses a turn and goes down an embankment. And again, I don't have all the facts, just what I picked up in the media. And yet much was made by the news media of, well, gee, maybe they shouldn't have been pursuing that car that was weaving. And of course, what I noticed most was, well, the car was weaving before the pursuit started. It's just as likely he would have woven into another car at some point. Or if this other car was driving at the legal speed but just being pursued at that rate, that's not a high-speed chase. What I'm getting at here is, in terms of the analysis that you'll be doing, are you trying to take a look at evaluating different kinds of chases? Are there pursuits that are not high speed, that you just maintain speed?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, you're absolutely correct. There's a lot of different types. Sometimes, I've personally been involved in several myself throughout my career, and you may have a driver that just is going to continue at the posted speed and just isn't going to stop. And you have that type. You have, like you say, very high speed, very reckless, and that's where you really want to consider, is this worth pursuing, that type of thing. I don't have all the particulars on the 2 that you refer to, and I know that they're under study and analysis as far as what was done and what was properly followed and so on. And you know, they're a very difficult situation, you know, a pursuit. And you want to minimize your liability as much as possible. And the spike strip, we feel, has been one way to limit that liability. And we have terminated pursuits where the driver has been under the influence of intoxicants, and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 miles after the pursuit's been terminated, they have crashed. So there is just a whole mix of scenarios. It could be a bank robber. It could be somebody who merely doesn't have a driver's license. You just never really know what you're dealing with when that individual starts to disobey the warning lights of the police officer.
I found it interesting that you mentioned that the survey of the 7 states' policies out of Detroit is suggesting that perhaps our policy is the most restrictive. That to me means that we tell our officers, we put more restraints on our officers than other states do. Did I read that correctly?
Right, that would be the result of their report, yes.
It might make me curious as to whether or not we might be less restrictive after we review the policy.
That could be. That could be.
Look, one of the things we're seeing these days is citizens generally clamoring for more police protection, for more willingness by politicians to be supportive of the police and help them do their job. A lot of politicians talk that way, they don't always act that way. I could make that comment at least. The question I would have for you then in the broader sense is, are we also going to have to take a look at our social attitudes about what the role of the police should be as protectors of the community, as people who intervene to protect us from wrongdoers? Sometimes we seem to hear from the folks who only want to talk about protecting the suspects. Mm-hmm. Others may only talk about the victims, but it seems to me we ought to be talking about society generally too. That what are our standards as a society as to maintaining a balance, making sure that the officer has enough authority and discipline mm-hmm. to get out there and capture a suspect. We want to protect society from what the suspect may have done or may be willing to do. Yet there are bystanders, and sometimes there may even be passengers in the car. Are these all the kinds of things you're going to be talking about, or are you focusing more on the specific pursuit and getting after the suspect?
Well, I guess we don't want to say that catching the suspect is necessarily the total end result. I mean, granted, yes, we want to get that person and have them appropriately taken care of, but we must also consider, like the bystanders, the innocent people, and we not only have to protect those individuals, but we have to weigh that. I guess that has to go through the officer's mind, because we need to protect society. I mean, protection of people and property is the role of the police officer, and yet we got to maintain a service to the public or to society, and we have to keep in focus what society needs from the police department. We cannot operate independent from that, so therefore we have to be receptive to what society's needs are in performing our jobs. And I guess in a pursuit situation, is the factor that important? You know, we don't want to injure innocent people and so on.
Now, you mentioned earlier, before we started this program, that, speaking privately to me, that the recruits also are trained in some basic pursuit policies. Can you explain that a little bit in terms of vehicle pursuits and the like?
Yes. Well, they're taught the policy. They're aware of the policy. We also have a driving training course for them, and those recruits are required to go through that course, and it involves pursuit driving and proper motor vehicle operation other than pursuit, just general patrol type functions. And so it is an extensive training, and of course they ride with a coach for anywhere from 3 to 4 months after that basic training. And so the coach is doing the driving, the recruit is sitting as a passenger and observing for a good share of that time. And then the recruit officer is allowed to take over and drive that patrol car under the immediate supervision or guidance of his or her coach.
Is the coach actually there for part of the recruit's training once the recruit's out on the road, or is a recruit just driving solo? No,
the coach is with the recruit, and then a supervisory decision is made whether that recruit is ready to go on their own or not, and it's daylight hours only at first, and Then they go through another coach-type training, and then if acceptable, then they will go to nighttime traffic patrol or patrol.
That's very interesting, because the public perception, if you just ask the person on the street, is, well, they probably send them to the academy and then they hand them their badge and send them out in the car. But what you've pointed out is a real gradual process of increasing responsibility.
Yes.
Well, let me mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm your host, State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and we're talking about police pursuit policies. We'll be talking for a moment here for the next few minutes, our last few minutes of the show, about the use of deadly force, and that sort of overlaps with the whole question of pursuit. If at any time you have any questions or concerns for me, please write to me at Capital Insight, H 395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. Now, I was just mentioning, Captain Stevenson, the pursuit philosophy and concern has to do with capturing a suspect and bringing someone to justice. There's also the question of the use of force, the use of firearms or any other kind of force that might be necessary. Can you give us a shorthand idea of what the policy is on the use of other kinds of force or firearm force on suspects?
Well, deadly force could only be used if there's going to be imminent physical injury to the officer, a third party, and so basically it's a very imminent injury type situation where the officer could be justified in using deadly physical force. And as far as use of force, we've gone to what is called capstun, and I think that has significantly limited the amount of actual physical wrestling or whatever that an officer would get involved in subduing a subject who has been arrested. And capstun basically is a momentary disabling spray.
Is that the pepper type spray?
Yes, that's correct. And I feel that has minimized the use of like nightsticks and other types of hands-on physical force by a police officer. But yes, the use of force is a very important factor, because many times a police officer is dealing with somebody that does not want to go where the police officer wants them to go. And the officer must still maintain the legal right to take a person into custody when they resist. And we have policy that dictates that. And I feel, and every case is reviewed when use of force is utilized. And it's a very important element of police work. A lot of times we don't like to be faced with it, but that's a lot of cases the bottom line.
As society's gotten more sophisticated and sensitive about issues of use of force by the authorities, it seems that we have had some assist from technology then, though. First there was mace, now there's capstun, and even those electronic devices that may shock somebody temporarily. Do you see us continuing to turn to technical innovations to help reduce the amount of other kinds of physical force we would have to use?
I would think that there will be new technologies and other devices. I'm not aware of anything on the horizon right now, but like I say, that's a very important part of police work. We don't plan it usually, it just happens. And the police officer has to be available with the best training and the best technology available to fulfill that portion of his or her job too.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We're just running into our last part of the program. I'd like to mention to our viewers that I hope you will never have to be stopped by the use of this kind of device. But on the other hand, if you're a victim of a crime and someone is trying to elude the police, I hope that they're able to capture that victim. And Captain, I appreciate, I said victim, capture the suspect to protect the victim, but I'm glad that you're here, I'm glad that you were with us, and thank you all for joining us on Capital Insight, and please join us next time.